It was an ordinary afternoon at the office, like any other. I was immersed in spreadsheets, budgets, and reports, so absorbed in my work that I hardly noticed the movement around me. Routine, that monotonous companion that accompanied me every day, gave me a false sense of security. But that day, all it took was a second, a quick glimpse, for everything I knew to begin to crumble. In that instant, as I looked up, I saw him. My boss, the figure I had admired and respected so many times, was crossing the corridor towards the meeting room. It wasn't the act of walking that caught my attention, but the destination of his path. He wasn't going to discuss projects or strategies with other colleagues. He was going to her. To the woman I called wife. Something stirred inside me. A restlessness that began to eat away at every shred of calm I could still pretend to have. At first, I tried to rationalize. It could be an ordinary meeting, I thought. She works here too, it's part of everyday life. But the feeling of something wrong was suffocating. So I did something I'd never done before. I followed them. The glass walls of the office, once transparent and harmless, now became a cruel barrier. I could only see bits and pieces of what was going on, fragments of gestures that told a story I didn't want to hear. They were sitting there, but there was something about the way he tilted his body, the way she avoided looking directly at the door, that made me uneasy. This is crazy, I muttered to myself, trying to calm the rising tide of despair. But the longer I stood there, watching, the more the pieces began to fit together. The strange schedules, the calls that ended abruptly when I arrived, the smiles she kept only for him. My heart started racing, as if it already knew what my mind was refusing to accept. When they left the room, I quickly hid behind a partition. Her laughter echoed in the corridor, a sound that, until then, had been exclusively mine. And then one of his sentences cut through the air like a knife, after hours, in the same place. My blood ran cold. It was no longer paranoia. It was no longer a suspicion. Something was happening. Something I needed to confirm, no matter how much the truth threatened to destroy what little balance I still had. The next few hours at work were unbearable. Every minute seemed to drag by, weighed down by unbearable tension. I needed to act, I needed to know. So I decided. I wouldn't go home. Not at that moment. Instead, I waited. I waited for her to leave, I waited for him to leave too. And I followed them. They weren't careful. Perhaps they thought that no one would be watching them, that they were safe under the protection of routine. But I was there, my eyes on every detail. They entered a discreet restaurant, a place that seemed designed for furtive encounters. And I, in my car, watched it all, adrenaline mixed with pain turning every second into a torment. As I watched through the window, something broke inside me. It wasn't just anger, it wasn't just pain. It was a feeling of betrayal so deep that I could hardly breathe. She laughed as if she had no worries, as if the man next to her was the center of her world. And I, on the other side, felt invisible. How could she do this? I thought, my mind struggling to find answers that might never come. Memories began to surface without permission. The tender moments, the promises made quietly in the dark, the plans for the future. Everything now seemed empty, a farce built on a castle of lies. When they left the restaurant, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't just watch. I had to confront them, even if it meant facing the truth I feared so much. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was the fear of what I might say or do. Maybe it was the need to think clearly before acting. So I went home. That night was hell. The walls of the room seemed to surround me, crushing me with the weight of what I knew. And when she arrived, late as always, with an excuse ready on the tip of her tongue, I just watched her. I didn't ask her anything. I didn't confront her. I just waited. Because now I knew I needed proof. Not just to convince me, but to destroy any defense she might put up. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to find out everything. Not just the crumbs she left behind, but every detail, every lie. And what I discovered was even worse than I had imagined. They weren't just having an affair. There was something more. Something much bigger that she was hiding. Something that could destroy me in ways I didn't even understand. Now, as I look at her, so carefree, so sure that her secret is protected, I feel something different growing inside me. It's not just anger or pain. It's determination. Determination to expose every bit of this betrayal, to show her and the world who she really is. And when that happens, there will be no turning back. Not for her. Not for him. But the question that won't leave me alone is, what else is she hiding? What else is behind this facade of a perfect wife, this betrayal that is already so cruel in itself? And, above all, how am I going to survive what's to come? Welcome to the channel where stories of love, betrayal and reversals reveal the devastating impact of infidelity. Here, we don't support any kind of betrayal. All the stories are fictional, created to show how disloyalty can destroy lives, relationships and dreams. Get ready to dive into an intense and shocking narrative that will hold your attention from start to finish. Good story. The clock struck 7:30 in the morning and the city began to pulsate with the movement of cars, hurried pedestrians, and the rhythmic noise of urban life. For Daniel, it was just another ordinary day. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of strong coffee in hand, his eyes scrolling through the emails on his cell phone as he nibbled on a piece of toast. Next to him, his wife, Laura, was making final notes on a notepad. She seemed distracted, but her meticulous posture gave away her total focus on some detail that only she understood. That was how she worked. Organized, practical, always one step ahead. They had been married for 12 years and, to their friends, seemed the picture of a perfect couple. Daniel was a partner in a growing technology company, a determined, hard-working man and, above all, true to his values. Laura, on the other hand, was a marketing consultant for a large corporation. Intelligent, charismatic and admired by everyone, she had the natural talent to turn every project into a resounding success. Despite their demanding careers, the couple always tried to maintain a harmonious routine. Candlelit dinners on Saturdays, carefully planned trips and that complicity built up over time. But underneath this impeccable surface, there was something subtle, almost imperceptible, that gradually distanced them. Daniel felt, although he had never named the feeling, that routine had crept in between them like a silent fog. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was just the weight of commitments, expectations, and the daily rush. Laura looked up from her notebook and smiled. "I'm working late today, I have an important meeting with the CEO. Don't expect me for dinner." Her voice was casual but firm. Daniel nodded, used to her dedication to her work. "I understand. If you need anything, let me know," he replied, trying to hide a twinge of frustration. It wasn't the first time that their dinner plans together had been cancelled, but he tried hard not to show it. He knew that Laura took her career seriously, and he respected that. The day passed slowly for Daniel. At the office, he led meetings, reviewed reports, and followed up on a new partnership that was about to close. Despite being physically present, his mind wandered elsewhere. He thought of Laura, the years they had shared and the strange feeling that something was changing. He wasn't the type who liked confrontation, he preferred to keep his doubts to himself and try to resolve them with simple gestures, like bringing home flowers or preparing a special dinner. Meanwhile, Laura was experiencing a different kind of day. The pressure at work was intense, but she seemed to thrive under it. That morning, her boss, Roberto, had requested a private meeting. Roberto was an enigmatic man, with a confidence that exuded from every gesture. He was the kind of leader who inspired respect while maintaining an aura of mystery. Laura always saw him as an exemplary professional, someone she admired, but she never let him go beyond the limits of a strictly professional relationship. "Laura, I'm counting on you for this," he said, looking directly into her eyes during the meeting. The campaign needs to be flawless, and only you have the talent to ensure that. There was something about the way he spoke, a magnetism that made it hard to look away. I got it, she replied without hesitation. Laura was used to taking on big responsibilities. However, that afternoon, something in the intensity of Roberto's gaze made her feel uneasy. A fleeting sensation, but impossible to ignore. When she finally returned home that evening, Laura found Daniel sitting on the sofa with the television on at a low volume. He was tired, but still got up to greet her with a kiss on the cheek. "Did everything go well at work?" he asked, genuinely interested. "Yes, a busy but productive day," she replied, as she put her bag on the chair and took off her shoes. They chatted for a few minutes, but their tiredness soon meant that silence dominated the room. Laura went to her room, while Daniel remained in the living room, lost in thought. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't identify what it was. Maybe it was just the stress, maybe it was the routine. He didn't know. Over the next few weeks, the small moments of distance began to accumulate. Laura spent more and more time at work, and Daniel took refuge in his home office, immersed in distracting projects. The marriage, although functional, seemed to lose its former luster. There were no fights, just a growing distance, a silent chasm that they didn't know how to cross. Even so, Daniel didn't give up. One evening, he decided to surprise Laura with a special dinner. He prepared her favorite dish, lit candles and set the table with a care he hadn't shown in a long time. When she arrived, the surprise on her face was genuine. "You didn't have to do all that," she said, touched by the gesture. "I wanted to," he replied, smiling. "I think we need more moments like this." For a few hours, it seemed that everything was fine. They laughed, talked about old memories and, for a moment, the flame that united them seemed to reignite. But while Daniel saw dinner as a fresh start, Laura seemed to treat it as a momentary pause in the chaos. A pause that would inevitably end as soon as routine returned. That night, while Daniel slept soundly, Laura lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts were a jumble of doubts, desires and regrets. She loved Daniel, or so she told herself. But there was something missing, something she couldn't name. The alarm went off at 6 in the morning, and another day began. Daniel was preparing coffee while Laura was getting ready to go out. They exchanged routine words, but without the depth of before. He watched her leave, feeling that twinge of unease again. Something was changing, and he knew he had to find out what it was. But he didn't yet know that the answers he was looking for would be far more devastating than he could have imagined. The days continued to unfold with the quiet predictability of a routine. Daniel woke up early, made the coffee, and Laura left for work with a hasty smile and a kiss on the cheek, as she always did. It was normality masking the growing chasm between them. However, something in Daniel was changing. He felt a heaviness in the air, a sense that the pieces of his world weren't fitting together as before. Intuition, that voice he rarely listened to, was beginning to cry out. One afternoon, while reviewing contracts in his office, Daniel's phone vibrated with a message from a coworker. "We need to adjust the project budget by tomorrow." It was an ordinary message, but something caught his attention. Next to the notification, the location-sharing app that he and Laura had set up for convenience flashed on his screen. Laura wasn't in the office. She was in a restaurant on the other side of town. Daniel hesitated. It wasn't unusual for her to have meetings outside the office, but something about that location bothered him. He knew the place, it was discreet, frequented by executives looking for privacy. A subtle annoyance began to turn into a nagging suspicion. He tried to ignore it, but the unease wouldn't leave him alone. Later that evening, when Laura arrived home, he casually asked the question, "How was your day?" "Tiring," she replied, as she sat down on the sofa. "Lots of meetings." He just nodded. He didn't press, didn't reveal that he knew more than she thought. But inside, Daniel began to put together a plan. He needed answers, and he wasn't willing to wait for them to fall into his lap. Over the next few days, Daniel began to observe Laura more closely. The schedules that didn't make sense, the vague excuses, the way she seemed distracted even on the rare evenings they spent together. Doubt, once a distant shadow, now hovered over every interaction. One evening, while going over some papers at home, a detail caught his eye. Laura's laptop was on the table, and she had forgotten to close an email. He wasn't the invasive type, but something inside him, a mixture of curiosity and desperation, pushed him forward. He opened the email, and the contents left him paralyzed. "About our next meeting, can't wait to see you again." There was no name, just a generic sender. But the sentence, so simple and loaded with implications, was like a punch in the gut. He felt a wave of heat run through his body, anger mixing with disbelief. He quickly closed his laptop and took a deep breath. It wasn't concrete proof yet, but it was enough to fuel his suspicions. Over the next few days, Daniel became an impromptu detective. He began to pay attention to every detail: Laura's departure times, the messages she quickly deleted, the calls she made in a hushed voice. And then, one day, the opportunity he hadn't expected arrived. While in a meeting at work, Daniel received a call from a colleague. "I'm in the parking lot and I just saw your wife entering the meeting building with Roberto, her boss. They seem very close." The news hit like a bombshell. Daniel was grateful, but his mind was already working frantically. He knew he had to act. The insecurity that had previously held him back was now driving him forward. The next morning, he decided to follow Laura. It wasn't something he imagined doing, but the need to know the truth outweighed any discomfort. Laura left the house as usual, with her bag on her shoulder and a casual smile. Daniel followed her, keeping his distance. She didn't go straight to work. Instead, she stopped at a small cafe, where Roberto was already waiting for her. They chatted, and Daniel watched from afar. There was nothing explicit at that moment, but the complicity between them was undeniable. When they left the cafe, Daniel followed. They entered a discreet hotel in the city center. And it was there, the moment the elevator doors closed, that reality hit him full force. It was no longer a suspicion. It was no longer a doubt. Betrayal, once just a ghost, was now a fact. Daniel felt his legs go weak. A whirlwind of emotions swept over him: anger, sadness, humiliation. He wanted to confront them right then and there, but something held him back. This wasn't the time. Not yet. He needed more than an emotional outburst. He needed proof, something that left no room for excuses or lies. When he returned home, Daniel was exhausted but determined. He knew that what came next would be painful, but he had no other choice. Laura returned later that evening, as if nothing had happened. They dined in silence, and Daniel watched her as if he were seeing someone else, someone he no longer recognized. In the silence of the early hours, Daniel sat in the kitchen, staring into the void. He knew that Laura's betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg. There was something more. Something she hid as zealously as her infidelity. And he was about to discover that the lies went much deeper than he could have imagined. That gray morning, Daniel woke up with the weight of the last few weeks crushing down on him. The night before had been almost unbearable. Every glance at Laura, every gesture she made, was a vivid reminder of the betrayal he had uncovered. Despite the pain, he knew that there was still more to be revealed. The pieces of the puzzle were not complete, and he needed to put the whole picture together, no matter how painful it was. Laura was in the kitchen, preparing the coffee. Her expression was serene, as if nothing had happened. Daniel watched her from afar, wondering how someone could carry such heavy secrets without letting them show. Anger and hurt were eating away at him, but he remained calm. Today would be the day when the masks would come off. He had managed to arrange a meeting with Roberto at the company, under the pretext of discussing an important project. Daniel knew he had to be strategic. Confronting Laura directly would be pointless. she would find a way to deny or minimize it. Roberto, on the other hand, would have no way out. In the office, Roberto was sitting behind his desk, the usual confidence reflected in every gesture. Daniel entered and closed the door behind him, sensing the tension in the air. "Daniel," Roberto began, smiling, "what can I do for you?" Daniel ignored the attempt at cordiality. "I want to talk about Laura." Roberto's smile diminished, but he kept his composure. "What's wrong with Laura? Is something wrong?" Daniel leaned across the table, coming closer. His voice was calm, but charged with intensity. "I know about you too." Roberto hesitated. For a brief moment, his security mask slipped, revealing a glimmer of nervousness. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't?" Daniel laughed, a dry, almost cruel laugh. He placed his phone on the table and opened a series of photos and messages he had collected. "Then explain this." Silence filled the room. Roberto looked at the evidence, trying to formulate an answer. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You weren't supposed to find out that way." "How did you want it, Roberto?" "For me to just ignore it while you two laughed at me behind my back." "It's not that simple," Roberto replied, his voice lower. "Laura, she has her reasons." "Reasons?" Daniel interrupted, his voice rising in pitch. "What reason would justify that? You destroyed what was left of my marriage and you want to talk to me about reasons?" Roberto took a deep breath. "It's not just about you two. Laura is involved in something bigger." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Roberto hesitated before answering. "Her relationship with me didn't start of its own accord. She was trying to protect something." Roberto's words echoed in Daniel's mind as he drove home. Something inside him told him that the truth was much closer than he had imagined. When he arrived, he found Laura in the living room, her gaze lost in the emptiness. It was now or never. "We need to talk," he said, entering the room. Laura looked at him, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "About what?" "About you. About Roberto. About everything." The silence in the room was almost palpable. Laura looked away, but Daniel didn't let her escape. "I know about you too. I know about the case. But now I want to know the truth. The whole truth." Laura tried to keep her composure, but desperation began to show in her eyes. "Daniel, please listen to me, I don't want excuses. I want answers," he cut in, his voice firm. "Roberto told me that there was something else behind this. That you were protecting something. What is it, Laura?" She hesitated, the words stuck in her throat. Finally, she took a deep breath and found the courage to speak. "I never wanted to betray you, Daniel. I love you, but I had no choice. No choice. Laura, no one made you do it." Daniel exclaimed, frustrated. "You're wrong," she replied, her voice breaking. "Roberto made me. He threatened me." Daniel stopped, confused. "Threatened? With what?" Laura closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "He found out something about the company. Something you hid. He knew that you had embezzled money to save the business. And he threatened to hand you over to the authorities if I didn't cooperate." Daniel stood motionless, as if the world around him had frozen. "Are you saying that he knew about this? That he used you to manipulate me?" Laura nodded, guilt evident in her eyes. "I was desperate, Daniel. I didn't know what to do. I thought that if I did what he wanted, he would leave you alone. So you sacrificed our marriage for this?" Daniel asked, his voice full of bitterness. "I did what I thought I had to in order to protect you," she shouted, the pain overflowing. "I didn't want to lose you, but I didn't know how to deal with it." Daniel ran his hand over his face, trying to process everything. He felt a mixture of anger, sadness and, surprisingly, a glimmer of understanding. The betrayal still hurt, but the revelation that Laura was acting to protect him complicated his feelings. "You should have come to me," he said at last. "We should have faced this together." "I know," Laura replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made a mistake, Daniel. I made a bad mistake." Silence hung between them, heavy with emotion. Daniel knew that their relationship would never be the same, but he also knew that the battle was far from over. Roberto had manipulated Laura, destroyed her marriage and threatened her career. And now Daniel had to decide what he would do with this truth. The silence in the room seemed to absorb all the air, leaving Daniel and Laura alone in a bubble of suffocating tension. The impact of the revelations was still reverberating in their thoughts, and they both remained motionless, as if any movement could crumble the fragile balance that remained. Daniel, sitting on the sofa with his hands intertwined, stared at the floor as if the answers he was looking for were hidden there. Laura, still standing, held on to the side of the table as if she needed support not to collapse. Her face was stained with tears, but now what stood out most was the look of guilt, a weight that seemed almost unbearable. "He ruined everything," Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice laden with bitterness. "It wasn't just you. He destroyed our lives. He destroyed everything." Laura didn't reply. Her words had run out. For weeks, she had rehearsed scenarios in her mind about how to confess, how to explain her decisions, but none seemed to apply now. Daniel knew. He knew everything, and anything she said would just be another nail in the coffin. "I'm going to end this," Daniel declared suddenly, rising from the sofa with renewed determination. He walked over to the window and looked out at the horizon, where the lights of the city were beginning to flicker against the darkening sky. "I can't let Roberto continue to control our lives." "Daniel, please," Laura began, but her voice was cut off by his firmness. "No, Laura. I have to do this. For you, for me, for everything we can still save." He turned to her, his gaze more intense than ever. "You may not believe it, but there's still a part of me that wants to believe that this can be fixed." Laura felt a lump in her throat. As much as his words offered her a thread of hope, they also carried the weight of a condition. Daniel wanted to resolve the chaos Roberto had caused, but forgiveness was still a long way off, shrouded in a cloud of uncertainty. The next morning, Daniel entered Roberto's office like a hurricane. His secretary tried to stop him, but he ignored her. Roberto, taken by surprise, quickly got up from his chair. "Daniel, what are you doing here? I thought we'd finished talking." "Not at all," Daniel replied, his controlled anger making his voice sound even more threatening. He closed the door behind him, crossed his arms and faced him. "Now you're the one who's going to hear it." Roberto tried to maintain his calm posture, but the slight trembling of his hands betrayed him. "You're upset, Daniel. Let's talk like adults." "Adults?" Daniel gave a short, bitter laugh. "You have the audacity to talk about maturity after everything you've done? You blackmailed my wife, destroyed my marriage and tried to ruin my life. And you think I'm going to let that go?" Roberto tried to keep control of the situation, but Daniel didn't give him any room. He placed a dossier on the table that he had spent all night preparing. There were messages, records and even emails that he had managed to retrieve with the help of an IT colleague. Each page was proof of Roberto's abuse of power and the manipulation he had exerted not only on Laura, but on other employees too. "You think you can use people as pieces on your board, don't you?" Daniel continued, moving closer. Daniel continued, stepping closer. "Well, here's your final move. I'm going to expose you. To the board. To the authorities, if necessary. Your career ends here." Roberto turned pale, but tried one last card. "Do you really want to risk everything, Daniel? You know this won't end well for anyone. I might as well take you with me." "Take me," Daniel retorted, without hesitation. "But this time, I'll be prepared. And unlike you, I have something worth protecting. The veiled threat made Roberto flinch, and Daniel knew that, for once, he had gained the upper hand. Returning home that evening, Daniel found Laura sitting on the sofa, clutching a mug of tea in her hands. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and anxiety, but said nothing. He took off his coat, sat down next to her and sighed. "I spoke to him," he began, his voice tired. "He knows the game is over." Laura didn't reply immediately. Instead, she put the mug on the table and looked at him. "Now what? What's going to happen to us?" Daniel hesitated. It was the question he had been avoiding ever since the lies began to unfold. He knew the answer wouldn't be simple. It wasn't just a question of love or hurt. It was about trust, and that, he didn't know if it could be rebuilt. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I want to believe that we can get through this, but I'm still trying to understand how everything fell apart so quickly." "I never meant to hurt you," Laura whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to fight for us. If you let me." Daniel looked at her, searching for some spark of the woman he loved, the partner he had chosen to build a life with. There was regret in her eyes, but there was also sincerity. He knew that the decision to move on or not would be an internal battle that would take time. "For now," he replied, "let's focus on sorting out what we can. The rest, we'll see." Over the next few weeks, things began to change. Roberto was dismissed from the company, thanks to the evidence Daniel had handed over to the board. The scandal not only tarnished his reputation, but also served as an example that no one was above the consequences. Laura, for her part, resigned. She knew that staying in that environment would be impossible for both her and Daniel. Their marriage remained on shaky ground. There were good days, when they seemed to grow closer, and there were days when the emotional distance seemed insurmountable. But one thing was certain, they were both willing to try. Forgiveness was a long road, and Daniel was still struggling to find the balance between anger and hope. One night, while Laura slept, Daniel went out into the yard. He looked up at the starry sky, feeling the cold wind on his face. The weight of what they had faced was still there, but for the first time in months, he felt a small flame of determination ignite in his chest. The future was uncertain, but Daniel knew that whatever the outcome, it would not be defined solely by the betrayal they had suffered, but by how they chose to move forward. He took one last look at the house and went inside, determined to face each new day with the courage that the moment demanded. The end came like a silent but devastating storm. What had once seemed like an emotional battlefield was now giving way to decisions that would shape the future of each of them. Daniel, Laura and Roberto faced the consequences of their actions, each walking paths marked by choices that could no longer be undone. For Daniel, the period following the revelations was an emotional roller coaster. He had invested years in a marriage that now looked like a crumbling house of cards. But despite the pain and betrayal, there was something Daniel couldn't ignore, his desire to start again. Not with Laura, but with himself. After weeks of careful analysis, Daniel made the decision to leave everything behind. He filed for divorce, claiming that although there was still love, trust was broken beyond repair. Laura cried when she received the papers, but she didn't object. She knew that this was the inevitable consequence. Daniel sold the house where so many memories had been built and moved to a smaller apartment in a quiet neighborhood. He began to devote more time to the hobbies he had neglected for years and eventually began to travel. It was on one of these trips that he met Anna, a journalist with a vibrant and honest spirit. The connection between them was immediate and, for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt hope. It wasn't a love that sought to fill the voids left by Laura, but something new, built on a foundation of truth and mutual respect. He moved on, not as someone who was bitter, but as someone who had learned the value of prioritizing himself. Despite the scars, Daniel knew that his life was just beginning. For Laura, the fall was harder to bear. After quitting her job and signing the divorce papers, she found herself alone in a house full of memories that now seemed to haunt her. The weight of guilt was overwhelming, and every corner of the house echoed with memories of a marriage she had destroyed. She tried to get back on her feet, starting to work freelance on marketing projects. But loneliness was a constant companion, and she knew she would need to face up to her own responsibility in order to move forward. In an attempt to rebuild confidence in herself, Laura began attending therapy sessions. There, for the first time, she faced her own mistakes with clarity. There was no erasing the past, but there was a chance to learn from it. Months passed before Laura found the courage to meet Daniel again. In a discreet cafe, they talked. She apologized once again, but this time without expecting redemption. Daniel listened to her, and although there was no reconciliation, there was understanding. He forgave her, not for her sake, but for his own. Laura returned home with a lighter heart, determined to be better, even if it was too late to save what she had lost. As for Roberto, his fall was as public as it was painful. Daniel's evidence to the board resulted in his immediate dismissal. His reputation, once impeccable in corporate circles, was destroyed. Roberto tried to use his influence to cover up the scandal, but his attempts were futile. His name became synonymous with abuse of power and blackmail, and he was cut off from the social and professional circles he had previously dominated. Left with no options, Roberto left the city, moving to a place where he was not known. There, he tried to rebuild his life, but the weight of his mistakes continued to haunt him. In a moment of introspection, he realized that his obsession with control and power had led to the ruin of not only the lives of others, but also his own. It was a belated but necessary lesson. The storm had passed, but the effects remained. Each of them, in their own way, moved on, marked by the choices they had made and the consequences they had faced. For Daniel, the betrayal was no longer a weight he carried, but a lesson that propelled him towards a new and authentic life. For Laura, guilt was no longer a chain that bound her, but a motivation to never repeat the same mistakes again. And for Roberto, ruin was a painful lesson that unscrupulous power exacts a high price. If you've made it this far, tell us what you thought of this story. What was your favorite part? Which character impacted you the most? Leave your opinion in the comments, we want to know. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, we don't support any kind of betrayal here. Our aim is to show how these choices can destroy lives and to teach that honesty and respect are the basis of any relationship. See you next time.